All right, good evening, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to another short war summary. And today we're receiving some pretty big news about the whereabouts of the Wagner PMC as well as Prigozhin himself. Supposedly, Prigozhin has now gone back to Russia, which is in violation of the deal brokered between Prigozhin and Putin by Belarus. So let's jump into our first piece of news here, which says exactly that. It's a post from Forbes on Twitter, and it says that the Belarusian president Lukashenko says that Yevgeny Prigozhin is now in Russia and no longer in Belarus. And as I mentioned, it violates that deal. So this is a huge deal because it's sort of unclear at this point why Prigozhin would want to go back to Russia because he's not in the good graces of the Russians, and we have speculated that the Russians are probably trying to actively knock him off. Also, we've heard that the order was supposedly given to go ahead and start implementing the plans to eliminate Prigozhin. That was from Ukrainian intelligence. So, very unwise decision by Prigozhin, and without knowing more details, it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen with the situation, but this is one of the biggest stories of the day. And moving on to our next piece of news here, we have a post from the Kyiv Post, which says that there are currently no mercenaries of the Wagner PMC or their leader Prigozhin on the territory of Belarus. And this is even a weirder plot twist because now Lukashenko is not only saying that Prigozhin has left Belarus, he's also saying that there are no mercenaries of the Wagner PMC in Belarus either. So either Lukashenko is lying like crazy, or the Wagner PMC have left Belarus and gone somewhere else. The only place I can think of that they would have gone is back to Russia, and even at that, that seems very unlikely in itself. So even more confusing reports here, but it's just hard to tell exactly what's going on. So at this point, we're left to basically speculation. So we'll have to wait and see on this story as well. But moving on to our next one, we have a post from Fytux, which says Ukraine's military spy chief Budanov says that the threat of a Russian attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is receding. And this is from Reuters. And this is extremely good news as well because we have had quite a scare in the last few days that the Russians were apparently going to try to attack the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, cause a meltdown, and perhaps frame it as a false flag attack. It appears now that, at least according to the spy chief of Ukraine, that threat is going down. And I'm sure we're not out of the woods yet, but the fact that it's going down whatsoever is a positive thing in my opinion. So good to hear that, and hopefully they can keep neutralizing that threat. And moving on to our next piece of news, we have a post from Insider Paper, which also is a piece of breaking news. It says a group of former U.S. national security officials have held secret talks with prominent Russians, including the Kremlin's top diplomat, with the aim of laying the groundwork for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. And the source of this one is NBC News. And it's difficult to tell whether or not this is sanctioned by the U.S. government. It is a group of former U.S. national security officials, and it seems their objective is to try to get some kind of diplomatic solution going in the background. I'm not sure if this will ever really be successful because Ukraine has made it clear at this point they are completely unwilling to give up territory, and it looks like Russia is unwilling to just leave and not take any territory. So it seems that they're still at an impasse, but maybe this group of security officials can work something out to where there can be some progress toward peace. Although at this point, I'm not very optimistic on that, and I'm sure a lot of others aren't as well. So we'll be keeping an eye on this one as well. And moving on to our next piece of news here, we have a post from Nexta, which gives us some insight as to what kind of equipment situation both Ukraine and Russia are experiencing, specifically when it comes down to tanks. And a pretty interesting statistic here, Ukraine now has about 1,500 tanks when they had only 987 pre-war, and Russia has 1,400 now, and they had 3,400 before the war. So now Ukraine has more tanks than Russia, like the headline says up there at the top. And one thing that this chart I noticed does not take into account, as you'll see here that shows Russia with 1.4 thousand tanks, that Russia has been rolling out a ton of antiques from their museums and also their reserve stockpiles. So out of those 1.4 thousand tanks that they have, it's very likely that most of those are antiques and they're not in really good shape. Meanwhile, Ukraine has gotten a lot of new Western equipment, and it's very likely that their tanks are in better shape, although they probably have some old ones as well. But Ukraine is in a much better position when it comes from a tank supply standpoint. Also down here, you can see some statistics on heavy guns and MLRS. And for the sake of time in this video, I'm going to skip going over these numbers. But if you'd like to come back and look at it, it is on our Twitter page, and feel free to check it out. So, with that being said, moving on to our next piece of news here, we have a post from Clash Report, which says the Italian central bank has frozen Russian oligarchs' assets valued at around 2 billion euros, or $2.5 billion, following the invasion of Ukraine last year, and Italy seized assets including bank accounts, luxury villas, yachts, and cars. And I'm very glad to see that this country here, Italy, is stepping up and doing the right thing and seizing the oligarchs' assets, which is a good step in the right direction, in my opinion, because we've been saying for a long time that the assets of Russia should be seized and also liquidated and then eventually given back to Ukraine so that way they can help them rebuild. And it appears Italy is going ahead and setting a precedent on that. Unlike some other countries like Germany, where Scholz is very on the fence about that, almost refusing to do so for the time being. So Italy has taken a right move here, and hopefully many others will follow suit, so that way Ukraine can have all the resources they need to rebuild after this war gets completed. So with that being said, moving on to our next piece of news we have, it's from the ISW, and this was covered slightly in yesterday's short war summary. However, we do have a little bit more information about it today. It's reported that the Chinese President Xi Jinping personally warned President Vladimir Putin against threatening to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine during his visit to Moscow in late March. And while this did happen in late March and now it's July, this is a big deal that this got leaked out, because it leaked out at a very bad time, because now Putin's power is being challenged publicly. People are wondering if he's truly in charge anymore. And now the story leaks out, basically showing that the Chinese president is trying to boss Putin around by telling him what he can and can't do with his own weaponry. So I'm sure that Putin was not thrilled to see this come out, and it probably will end up hurting the relationship between Xi and Putin and that so-called no-limits partnership that they allegedly have. And apparently the partnership does have limits, because if Xi is unwilling to let Putin use nukes in Ukraine, then it appears that is the limit of the partnership, which is for once a sensible thing that I've ever seen come out of that little partnership they got going right there. So with that being said, as I always like to say, we're moving on to our last piece of news, which is from the Kyiv Post as well, and it says that Ukraine will refuse conscription after the war, says Prime Minister Denis, and, quote-unquote, the Ukrainian armed forces will stop conscription after the war in its current state and transition to NATO standards. So, to me, this is very good news as well, and obviously right now, Ukraine has to conscript to some extent because they are in a fight for their lives, and if they don't win this war, that means the destruction of Ukraine. So they're having to resort to these extreme measures such as conscription to make sure they have enough manpower to fight off the Russians. And I would imagine that this is understandable to most because if they don't have enough people, obviously they can't win the war. So it's good to know that after the war is over, they're going to start adhering to more of a volunteer standard than a conscription standard. So very good to see. So that was our last piece of news, and real quick, I just want to say that I'm sure that some of you have noticed my absence from the channel for a few days, and that's because I've been battling a very rough and very infamous bug that many of y'all have heard about over the last few years. It has been a rough few days for me, I have to admit. I'm almost back to normal, although not quite. You can probably tell that I sound a little low energy than usual. Tonight, we hope to be back on stream at 10 p.m. Eastern. And also, if you would, please press like on the video. Please subscribe to the channel, and also go peep our Twitter, because if you want the most up-to-date news on the war, that is where we post it, and that is the fastest way to get it. So go check out our Twitter, @It'sTheEnforcer. And also, if you want to support us on Patreon, you can see the link in the description below to support us over there and help us keep doing our work. So thank you all very much for watching, and bye-bye for now.